Hello and welcome to our Week 3 lecture on 18th and 19th century social movements. One of the things that can be a bit difficult to tell just from the discussion of political theory in that lecture this week is the degree to which political theory is not unfolding just as an abstract debate amongst philosophers talking about the best way to think about the state or about power, but it's unfolding in dialogue with social movements that are constantly pushing at the boundaries, particularly of liberal political theory, trying to extend them beyond the barriers that had been understood to sort of limit the applicability of these ideas when they're initially introduced. So what you have is a constant pressure on the boundaries that are originally drawn around liberal political rights. And this pressure is one of the reasons that so many of our readings from last week talk about modernity as an ongoing critical project. Okay, it's this sense of the dynamism over time of the fact that the ideas themselves have corrosive critical potential and they can be seized by movements of various sorts, and those movements can push on and extend the boundaries of that criticism. And so modernity seems to be an ongoing process of deepening and extending these particular ideals. Heller last week, if you took a look at that reading, talks about modernity as a paradox, as a foundation that will not found, or a ground that is not a ground. And this is part of what she has in mind with that sort of strange concept, the idea that you've got a set of things that, because they are based in criticism, the extension of boundaries, the extension of freedom, means that there's no fixed point to which they're headed or on which they're based. And Strauss takes up this point and talks about it in relation to relativism. Are there any, in fact, absolute standards? Is the corrosive process just going to eat itself in the end? Okay, and these are debates that often arise and that are making reference to the process of these social movements, but may not be explicit about the fact that that's what they have in mind. So you have changing forms and priorities of social movements over time. So one way to group the conflicts is to think of them as being around representation, as in who has the right to vote or to be represented in formal political discussion, redistribution, so the social resources and economic resources of a society and who has access and entitlement to those, and recognition. So the range of different ways that one can be excluded from meaningful participation in social and political life that may not be fully resolved by redistributing wealth or by reallocating the vote. Okay? Many conflicts span these categories. It's often not possible to neatly say, well, here's a movement and it is only about representation, or here's a movement that is only about recognition. Often these three categories are implicated in particular movements, especially in this time, but even today. And you also get some early discussions of what are now called intersectionality, which is a big word, but what it talks about is the fact that you can get a movement that presents itself as though it is representing the interests of everyone that seems to fall under the category of that movement. So you can get women's movements or civil rights movements, and yet often these movements are being pushed by or are particularly sensitive to the needs of a particular subset of the group it claims to be representing. So feminist movements might represent women of a particular class or race and not be attending to the issue of how their demands intersect with the experiences of people who don't fall into that class or race category, but who are women nonetheless. So debates about intersectionality have become quite prominent in recent decades, but they're part of the social movement process all along. So what I want to do now is walk through a series of major movements. The handout that accompanies this lecture gives you some longer passages in addition to the ones that I'm going to focus on here, and just give a feel for the ways in which the movements are pushing the boundaries of the original liberal political discourse over time. And we'll pick this up again in the final weeks of the course when we return to political and social movements as a topic. Okay, so the first document is the American Revolution, and these are some of the initial very dramatic extensions of the liberal ideals, although the liberal ideals themselves often emerge in quite revolutionary contexts. So the American Revolution is a sort of post-colonial struggle, but it's by the descendants of the colonizers rather than by indigenous populations. But when you are getting post-colonial structures that are deriving from indigenous populations. They often look back to the texts of the American Revolution for some of their initial starting points. So this is a sort of a resonant document. And you can see in this document the concepts of classical liberalism that we discussed in the previous lecture this week coming to play and being used as part of the critique of the government that's overseas. So when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So again, this idea that governments are dependent on the consent of the governed, that they are essentially a social contract, and that in principle at least it's possible for people to go off to move out of the social contract they've been involved in and make a new social contract with new groups of people. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? So again, the sorts of rights that we've already encountered on political theory, that people are equal, that they are rights-bearing entities, that the pursuit of happiness, life and liberty, that self-preservation and freedom are core values. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Okay, so governments have a purpose to which they're subordinated. They can't do anything they want. They're there to do these things, and if they're not doing these things, then some kind of change of government is necessary. Deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, again, the social contract imagery. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Social contract conception, consent of the governed, and the people are the source of the legitimacy of the government. So when that legitimacy falls, the people can construct a new kind of government. And the French Revolution. In the handout you have Abbe Sieyes' What is the Third Estate? And it refers to class divisions in French society, where you've got clergy and nobility with substantially more effective political power than everyone else. The Third Estate is everyone else. And Sieyes says we must ask ourselves three questions. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been hitherto in politics? Nothing. What does it ask? To become something. Okay? And he makes an argument that is a quite characteristic one that will carry over in communist revolutions in the future. The Third Estate, he says, does everything that's actually required to the proper functioning of a nation. The other two estates are dispensable. Okay, they're sort of parasitic on the Third Estate. They don't really do anything. So the Third Estate, in fact, can get rid of the other two and be just fine, but the other two are dependent on it. The people wishes to be something, but in truth a very modest something, he says. They want to have real representatives in the Estates General, which is an advisory consultative body for the monarchy. That is to say, deputies chosen from among their own ranks. People cannot come and vote in the Estates General unless they can have influence at least equal to that of the other two. The Third Estate therefore demands that votes be counted by head, not by orders. This is much more numerous part of the population. It wants its votes to be counted by head. It will outnumber the others then and have much greater influence. There's a lot of fear of extension of the franchise in this period and a lot of debate over how and whether and in what way to extend the franchise. Conservatism, in its modern form, is also a social movement of sorts, an intellectual movement of sorts, and it is also new. It's articulating itself against these revolutionary experiences, many of which devolve into intense violence in a way that is quite horrifying to people who are looking on the outside. And so this is Edmund Burke, a classic statement of modern conservatism, reflecting on and reacting to the revolution in France. And what he's doing is drawing contrasts with English history and saying that France had a similar enough history that it could have gone a similar path to the English. Now, in reality, there's something a little odd about his depiction, because a lot of the things he's discussing were things that emerged in quite bloody ways in England itself. It's just further in the past at the point that he's writing. But he talks about the possibility of pointing back to your ancestors and in having a form of politics that is predicated on great respect for the past and for your forebears and is what has already been accomplished. He says, this policy appears to me to be the result of profound reflection, or rather the happy effect of following nature, which is wisdom without reflection and above it. A spirit of innovation is generally the result of a selfish temper and confined views. People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. Is there something we can conserve, something we can preserve, something that we can extend from our past, rather than trying to wipe everything away and initiate a new history? Thus, by preserving the method of nature in the conduct of the state, in what we improve, we are never wholly new. In what we retain, we're never wholly obsolete. So there's this notion that you'll find in a lot of texts of this period that nature works by the gradual modification of what already exists. Okay, this is the thing that sort of Darwin uses when he starts developing a theory of natural selection. Okay, the idea that nature doesn't whole cloth obliterate things and start over fresh. It works by gradual modification. And Burke suggesting that this is how we should work in government. No radical revolutions, no sudden wiping of the slate, but gradual amendment and modification. Always acting, he says, as if in the presence of canonized forefathers, very sacred forefathers. The spirit of freedom, leading itself to misrule and excess, is tempered with an awful gravity. Okay, so he's worried that the spirit of freedom itself will wipe too much away, will obliterate too many things. This idea of a liberal descent inspires us with a sense of habitual native dignity, which prevents that upstart insolence almost inevitably adhering to and disgracing those who are the first acquirers of any distinction. By this means, our liberty becomes a noble freedom. Okay? Worried about the excess if you think that you're inaugurating something new. Okay. And this is something that persists. This is not just an old view. This is an aspect of worries and fears and critiques about revolutions that has some grounding in later history in terms of revolutions that tend to think that they're wiping the slate, that they're creating a new man, a new humanity, often do quite terroristic things. We procure reverence to our civil institutions on the principle upon which nature teaches us to revere individual men on account of their age and on account of from whom they are descended. Okay, so there may be a value in looking at the institutions that have some longevity to them. There may be something worth revering there rather than wiping everything away. He attracts a great deal of indignation from Mary Wollstonecraft, who writes a response to his piece titled A Vindication of the Rights of Men. She asks, will Mr. Burke be at the trouble to inform us how far we are to go back to discover the rights of men, since the light of reason is such a fallacious guide that none but fools trust to its cold investigation? Okay. All human institutions, she says, are unavoidably imperfect, settled in the dark days of ignorance, when the minds of men were shackled by the grossest prejudices and most immoral superstition. And do you, sir, a sagacious philosopher, recommend night as the fittest time to analyze a ray of light? This enlightenment imagery. We've moved into an enlightened time. It's brighter, we see farther, we see more clearly. It doesn't make sense to talk about what we've inherited from our ancestors because they're barbarians, they're superstitious, they're more ignorant than we are. We see more clearly. She says, it is necessary to repeat that there are rights which men inherit at their birth as rational creatures, who were raised above the brute creation by their improvable faculties, and that in receiving these, not from their forefathers but from God, prescription can never undermine natural rights. Okay? So it's not our traditions that are important, it's something that transcends those traditions. Wollstonecraft identifies it with God, but it is the natural rights that people possess, that they would possess in any society, that can be used to criticize that society itself and can be a basis then for revolutionary transformations. Allowing his servile reverence for antiquity, so she thinks Burke is being servile, that he's being subservient, and prudent attention to self-interest. She thinks that he has a reason to be advocating these things that is not entirely disinterested. To have the force which he insists on, the slave trade ought never be abolished, because our ignorant forefathers, not understanding the native dignity of man, sanctioned a traffic that outrages every suggestion of reason and religion. Okay? All sorts of horrific practices were authorized by the past. If we are overly obedient to the past, we will never overcome these things, even though our reason and our beliefs give us the ability to do so. Okay, so the pushback against his conservatism. Then we have Chartism, which is an example of one of the many movements that's pushing for the extension of the franchise. Now, there's a lot of fear over the extension of the franchise because the people you're extending it to are more numerous than the people who currently possess it. So the franchise, the ability to vote, was restricted to people who were viewed as having a solid long-term investment in their community, which meant that they were male, they were of a dominant sort of race, and they had property. They were wealthy enough, and that wealth was perceived to give them a stake. And there was a widespread belief that if you extended the franchise, the first thing that would happen is that the majority of the poor, the working classes, would immediately strip all the wealth from above. And a lot of the elements that are built into our current day democracies, a lot of the representative structures that mean that you don't have immediate direct voting on everything, but you elect people who then represent your interests, are actually meant to provide a safety valve so that the great majority of the working and the poor don't immediately attack the more privileged. But Chartism is one of these movements that is pushing for the extension of the franchise. It's pushing for universal male suffrage. It wants voting in secret. It wants property not to be a requirement for serving in Parliament. It wants parliamentary positions to be paid, and this is to enable people to take up those positions who otherwise would have to work for a living. It wants electorates that represent equal numbers of the populations, and it wants regular elections. Okay, now, Carlyle is hardly a radical, but he's describing the movement, pointing out the fact that it is driven in part by economic concerns and the treatment of the working classes, and is challenging people to think about whether movements like this reflect a real set of social issues that need to be addressed in order to diffuse revolutionary potential. He describes it as delirious Chartism. People react as if people have gone mad. What do you mean assembling in such huge numbers, making these political demands? But he says, delirious Chartism will not have raged entirely to no purpose, as indeed no earthly thing does so, if it have forced all thinking men of the community to think of this vital matter too apt to be overlooked otherwise. Is the condition of the English working people wrong? So wrong that rational working men cannot, will not, and even should not rest quiet under it. What are the rights, what are the mights of the discontented working classes in England at this epoch? Okay? The 19th century is a period of increasing working class militancy and mobilization, and it is worrying people. They're worried how devastating its effects will be. We've already had examples from the previous century of great revolutionary movements that have wiped away forms of government. What will this movement do? How revolutionary will it become? What sort of society will we end up with after it? Okay, and then what do we do now to prevent it? Can we improve economic and social conditions, and will the political demands go away? Can we give in to some political demands and not have to worry so much about the economic and social question? These things get debated. And in 1848, you have a series of uprisings all across Europe, and they spread to Latin America. They start in France. They're all suppressed. It's a defeated set of revolutionary movements. Toqueville, the piece in the handout, is actually written relatively close to the time of these, but it's not actually published until after he dies, which is why the date listed there is so late. But the handout describes the experience of watching rumors spread and barricades rise and the crowds assemble. It's quite a fun piece for its descriptive value. But it also captures the growing fear and uncertainty. What is this kind of revolution going to entail? This sense that the working classes are mobilizing as a whole, and this is a dangerous new force. Continuing on my way at the entrance to the Rue Saint-Honoré, I met a crowd of workmen anxiously listening to the cannon. These men were all in blouses, which, as we know, constitute their fighting as well as their working clothes. Nevertheless, they had no arms, but one could see by their looks they were quite ready to take them up. They remarked with a hardly restrained joy that the sound of the firing seemed to come nearer, which showed the insurrection was gaining ground, waiting for the revolution to catch up to them. I had augured before this that the whole of the working class was engaged, either in fact or in spirit, in the struggle, and this confirmed my suspicions. The spirit of insurrection circulated from one end to the other of this immense class, and in each of its parts as the blood does in the body. It filled the quarters where there was no fighting, as well as those which served as the scene of the battle. It had penetrated into our houses, around, above, below us, the very places in which we thought ourselves the masters, swarmed with domestic enemies. You can feel the fear here. Okay, the very places in which we thought ourselves the masters swarmed with domestic enemies. The working classes are in the houses of the upper classes. They're doing domestic duties. They're everywhere. The danger is everywhere. It is unplaceable. It is unstoppable. So there's an enormous amount of fear and then quite intense repression of these movements in reaction. And this is the period when Marx and Engels write the Manifesto of the Communist Party, and this is one of these pieces that you'll see referred to, lines from it quoted again and again and again in works through the term. The famous starting line, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have centered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre, Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies." Okay? And then this famous sketch that is not really analysis, this is a pamphlet rather than serious social theory, but it's been heavily influential on future social theory. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. Okay? And then this famous image of the bourgeoisie as the revolutionary force driven by the development of modern industry, driving the development of modern industry. The bourgeoisie is the class that cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, relations of production, the whole of society. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It's interesting. There's an external need driving the bourgeoisie, chasing them. This is part of what Weber is picking up on in his analysis. Weber's read Marx very, very closely, although he rarely refers to him explicitly. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. So the bourgeoisie is a revolutionary class for Marx, but the nature of its revolution, what it's creating out of the result, is a large working class with an incentive to seize power for itself. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felt feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Mm-hmm. And this is something that is a real active political goal and a real active fear among the upper classes through the 19th century. The anti-slavery movement as a major movement that is going on at the time cross-Atlantically, so people in England, people in Europe, people in the United States where the slave trade persists. This is Frederick Douglass talking about the anti-slavery movement and its long history, appealing to the same sorts of liberal ideals, to say that these same ideals are what this movement is about, but these ideals have been truncated. They have been denied to people who have been traded as slaves. Of the existence and power of the anti-slavery movement as a fact, you need no evidence. The nation has seen its face and felt the controlling pressure of its hand. You've seen it moving in all directions, in all weathers, in all places, appearing most where desired least, and pressing hardest where most resisted. No place is exempt. The quiet prayer meeting and the stormy halls of national debate share its presence alike. Okay? The quiet prayer meeting reference is no accident. Okay? There's a heavy, heavy religious component in the anti-slavery movement. He talks about it as a divisive movement that tears apart families and congregations. He says, the grand secret of its power is that each of its principles is easily rendered appreciable to the faculty of reason in man, and the most unenlightened conscience has no difficulty in deciding on which side to register its testimony. So again, the importance of reason, the ability to discern rights and what is right through reason, as being something that cannot be avoided, whatever your social custom is, whatever arbitrary social restrictions you place, there is something that transcends all of that. A man that does not recognize and approve for himself the rights and privileges contended for on behalf of the American slave has not yet been found. So Douglass is saying there's no one who is willing themselves to say, I don't personally need these rights, so why are the slaves demanding them? That's not the nature of the discussion. People who claim these rights for themselves are denying them to the slaves. In whatever else men may differ, they are alike in the apprehension of their natural and personal rights. The difference between abolitionists and those by whom they oppose is not principles. All are agreed in respect of those. The manner of applying them is the point of difference. So again, this movement, and this will be the case for many, many future movements, is claiming that it shares a tradition, it shares an understanding of rights. It agrees that these are natural rights, that they are rights that transcend human societies. It's pushing at the boundaries, the artificial restrictions that prevent these same notions of natural right from being applied to humanity as a whole. And here we have Wollstonecraft again, writing a vindication of the rights of women, just a couple of years after the vindication of the rights of man. Okay? Extending this same kind of logic, talking about women's rights. She uses the same sort of artifice-nature distinction. So women are not inferior to men by nature, but due to the corrupting effects of an artificial culture. She says women are everywhere in this deplorable state, for in order to preserve their innocence, as ignorance is courteously termed, so women are kept ignorant, and this is valorized and called innocence. Truth is hidden from them, and they're made to assume an artificial character before their faculties have acquired any strength. Taught from infancy that beauty is the woman's scepter, the mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming around its gilt cage, only seeks to adorn its prison. It is time to effect a revolution in female manners, time to restore them their lost dignity, and make them as part of the human species, labor by reforming themselves to reform the world. It is time to separate unchangeable moral from local manners. So it is an artificial local custom that women are taught that their virtue is in their beauty, that their minds have nothing to offer, and that they're told to exist in this very specific sphere. And then she uses a couple of hypothetical examples of women who have cultivated their faculties of reason and women who have not, in the not unlikely circumstance that they'd end up needing to take care of their families on their own because of the death of a husband. Then she says something that's going to be characteristic of this earlier wave of feminism and that's going to be contested by later waves. Women, I allow, may have different duties to fulfill. Okay, this acceptance, there may be something that later comes to be called separate spheres. But they are human duties, and the principles that should regulate the discharge of them, I sturdily maintain, must be the same. Okay, so there may be some sort of essential difference between men and women, or at least the spheres in which they operate. But the basic principles of human rights and reason and the principles that govern the rest of the liberal discourse of rights still apply here. And here's John Stuart Mill, whom we ran into in the lecture on political theory, writing on the subject of the subjection of women, quite a bit after Wollstonecraft. And he says, the principle that regulates the existing social relations between the two sexes, the legal subordination of one sex to the other, is wrong itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement. It ought to be replaced by a principle of perfect equality. And he talks about the fact that people take a great deal of pride in thinking that they live in a period in which the strongest no longer rule, or it is no longer accepted that force is the basis of legitimate authority. And he says we congratulate ourselves on this, but in fact, still in law, the principle of force is enshrined in relation to the subjection of women. So women are still allowed to be forcibly constrained by their fathers, by their husbands, by general social institution. And he says, it's an illusion to talk about how the rule of force has been overcome when we have this applying to such a large portion of our society. And he says, people will object that women's subordination is natural. And then he says, but was there ever any domination which did not appear natural to those who possessed it? Okay? The defense is always that a form of oppression is natural, that there's nothing we can do about it, that it's for the betterment of everybody, that everybody always benefits. And this has always been the thing that movements have contested and taken down. It's always needed to be shown empirically by taking it down that something else was possible. And he's got a lovely little argument here about arguments that something is unnatural. He says, the anxiety of mankind to interfere in behalf of nature, for fear lest nature should not succeed in effecting its purpose, is altogether an unnecessary solicitude. What women by nature cannot do, it is quite superfluous to forbid them from doing. If you literally naturally can't do something, what point is there in making a law telling you not to? What they can do, but not so well as the men who are their competitors, competition suffices to exclude them from. Okay, so you don't need a law to enshrine what you're claiming are natural restrictions. It's a very nice piece. And then the final piece in the handout is from Sojourner Truth. It's delivered in various forms, so this is one of the versions of it that floats around. She is an African American, someone who's been a slave, and her presence at women's rights movements, meetings, discussions is controversial because there's a worry that the slavery issue is going to sort of taint the question of the fight for women's rights. But she's able to point out in a very powerful way that the structuring of the debate over women's rights already itself assumes a particular kind of woman, a woman who lives in such a leisured class, in such privileged circumstances, that it becomes plausible to talk about things like, can she work, or can she do things for her own? But there is a whole mass of women for whom this is just a ridiculous question, because they are already making their way on their own. And so she gives this talk pointing out the class and racial assumptions of some of the arguments that structure the debate over feminism, and offers the possibility that the feminist movement, if it pays more attention to some of these other voices, is going to be able to come up with some pretty good empirical refutations of some of the things that are being said against the possibility of the movement. So she says, that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Like, it's the idea that we're not going to give women rights because they're so special and we'll put them in a safe little cotton-balled place. And she says, nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me the best of any place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I've ploughed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. Ain't I a woman? So the daintiness, the assumptions that women are too frail to do this stuff, are refuted empirically by her very life. Okay, so she has worked as hard manually as any man. Okay, so this is not a basis for denying women rights. Women can do these things. I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children, and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? It's a whole class of women who are not treated as though they deserve a special place, who are not pampered, who are not protected. Okay, but they're women. And the mainstream women's movement can use these experiences to contest the image of what women naturally are, what they naturally can do. And then she says, then that little man in black over there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. So again, grabbing the religious tradition, the story of how Christ is born, and contesting that men have some special closeness to Christ when it is through woman that he's brought into the world. And then another religious reference, if the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, thinking about Eve and the apple and the introduction of human history in Genesis, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they's asking to do it. The men better let them. Okay. Drawing from the religious tradition, the same religious tradition that's being used to argue against the feminist movement, drawing from it images of the intense power of women, and suggesting also in the way that some of the more contemporary intersectionality debates will, that movements harm themselves when they are inattentive to or when they refuse or reject insights that can be given by people who fall into multiple categories, who have diverse experiences, and many of these experiences might have a value to the movement itself. Okay, we'll talk about all this again when we get to the end of the term, the last couple of weeks, where we'll be looking more directly at social movements.